This infographic highlights an acronym that didn't exist before 1933. Drafted by a law student in London, influenced by ethno-nationalism sweeping Europe, he took 5 distinct South Asian regions, Punjab, Afghania, Kashmir, Sindh, and Baluchistan, mashing them into a single theoretical word, Pakistan. Looking at the borders drawn in 1947, the reality is staggering. The nation split into 2 separate landmasses, with 1,000 miles of hostile Indian territory between West and East Pakistan. With no shared infrastructure connecting these halves, this blueprint created an immediate logistical nightmare. The burden of holding this fractured geography together fell to founding father Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Barely a year after independence, he died of tuberculosis. The immense pressure transferred to the first prime minister, Liaquat Ali Khan. In 1951, while addressing a crowd in Rawalpindi, an assassin in the front row fired 2 shots. His final words were, "God protect Pakistan." In just 4 years, the primary architects of the state were gone. The remaining politicians inherited an economically starved country, desperately trying to build an administration from scratch. With the architects gone, the state was left with shared faith as its only tool to bind people who remained strangers to one another. It was a fragile glue for a project that was already under immense structural strain. The first major fracture occurred over language. The central government, seated in the West, declared that Urdu would be the sole national language. For the Bengalis in East Pakistan, who actually made up more than half the country's population, this was a direct erasure of their cultural identity. The Bengalis refused the mandate and took to the streets. In 1952, police fired on students protesting peacefully in Dhaka. The violence over their mother tongue permanently radicalized a generation in the East. By 1958, the civilian government had cycled through 5 different prime ministers in nearly as many years. This constant political paralysis convinced the military to step out of the barracks, declare martial law, and hand absolute executive control to General Ayub Khan. This graphic maps out a structural trap that defines the nation to this day, a constant mechanical swing. Civilian political failures inevitably trigger and legitimize military dictatorships, which eventually falter and hand power back to weak civilian governments. While power concentrated in the West, wealth was generated in the East. East Pakistan's jute industry brought in the majority of the nation's foreign wealth, but the central bank and military apparatus systematically diverted those funds to develop the West. By 1970, the pressure cooker snapped. The military held the first democratic elections based on universal franchise. A Bengali leader, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, legally won an outright majority. But the Western military establishment blatantly refused to hand over power to a Bengali. Instead of transferring power, the military launched Operation Searchlight. West Pakistani forces deployed to Dhaka with armor and artillery, initiating a brutal, months-long crackdown targeting the Bengali civilian population and intellectual elite. Millions of refugees fled across the border, sparking a war that ended with the surrender of 90,000 Pakistani troops. East Pakistan fractured permanently into the independent nation of Bangladesh. The core ideological premise justifying the state, that Muslims formed a single unified nation based purely on faith, had been tested and failed. Stepping into the ruins of 1971 was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. He was a westernized, Oxford-educated socialist. But to consolidate his grip on the traumatized country, he made a deeply pragmatic calculation, incorporating orthodox religious laws into the constitution to unify a fractured public. This shift exacted a massive intellectual toll. Dr. Abdus Salam, a brilliant theoretical physicist and the intellectual architect of Pakistan's space and nuclear programs, was marginalized and ultimately forced out of the country because his specific religious sect was legally declared non-Muslim by Bhutto's government. Following another military coup, General Zia-ul-Haq accelerated this process. Backed by billions in U.S. Cold War funding intended to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan, Zia's state apparatus transformed local mosques and seminaries into highly organized ideological factories, recruiting and radicalizing youth for global proxy wars. The state began systematically rewriting the nation's identity. History textbooks were edited to emphasize military conquest and Islamic orthodoxy, pushing the region's diverse, pluralistic roots to the margins. Decades later, under the military rule of General Pervez Musharraf, that geopolitical strategy spiraled out of control. The vast militant infrastructure the state had built and nurtured realized the government's foreign policy had shifted, and they violently turned their weapons on their own creators. The blowback culminated in the 2007 siege of the Red Mosque in the capital. Thousands of radicalized students clashed directly with the very military apparatus that had historically utilized them to project regional power. Looking closely at this quote at the base of the pendulum tells the entire story. A nation conceptualized as an exclusionary acronym remains caught in a dizzying loop, bouncing relentlessly between the rigid authority of the military, the ideological fervor of the mosque, and the fragile hope of the ballot box. The history of Pakistan suggests that a modern state is rarely held together by a theoretical acronym alone. Its survival depends on whether it can finally embrace the very linguistic and cultural diversity it once tried to erase.